We are back on Morning Line. Thanks for joining us. Our guest this morning, Clint Kelly, malpractice attorney here in town, taking your calls. We had a couple good ones this morning, one that always riles him up. Brian, asking you about tort reform and all of that.
No, I'm really glad he did, because it's an opportunity to share some knowledge and bring some light to something that's probably people don't know much about.
Absolutely. And Donna, of course, calling with a potential case. Could be a tough one, but if you want to jump in, 737-7587 is the number. You know, we're in the mornings here, and sometimes calls a little bit slower, but part of it too, Clint, is a lot of people, we have regular viewers to the show who've called and know what's going on with you right now. What you need to do is, if you have others that are dealing with that, give us a call right now. I'm just curious. I'd like to hit on a few of these cases that we've seen locally, and I've done stories with Clint on several cases that just leave you shaking your head. A lot of people, I think last week I got another email from someone, how's the little baby whose tongue was cut? I don't know, I just want to ask you that, because that went national, that story. And I don't think either of us thought it would have that kind of publicity that we got out of it, but it was a big, big story.
It was a huge story. As far as
People
I know,
magazine did something on
People,
it.
CNN, I mean, remember it went viral.
Yeah.
And as far as I know, the child's doing okay. I haven't gotten a definitive report from a pediatrician about his progress. The one who's having trouble is mother.
Okay.
Mother's the one that's really been broken up over this, and it's going to take some time to get over these emotional scars.
Since, by the way, this was a procedure where the newborn had something done to the tongue. It's called
had a frenulectomy.
Frenulectomy, that's right.
They get in there with scissors and they cut the skin under the tongue to free the tongue up. But he was the wrong child. He wasn't supposed to have it.
Mixing up the babies. How about that? Now, when you sue for damages in that case, are the damages for the child, or can it also go toward the anguish for the mother?
There's two of that's correct. There's two claims. One claim is for the child for actually having a procedure done on them that wasn't supposed to be done, which we talked about. Is called medical battery. The second claim is for the mother for what they call reckless infliction of emotional distress, and that's reserved in cases where someone either sees or is part of a really emotionally devastating event that can cause serious mental harm, whereas in this case it's mama who's had her child operated on when he didn't need it, and now she's been torn up over it pretty badly.
The child was taken and was in the nursery, and I think your case is going to be the latest and maybe front and center as you look at lawmakers maybe, or not lawmakers, rather hospitals looking at changing where they put newborn infants, right? We've always talked about, you and I when we were born, probably in a nursery, while our mother was recovering and father would look outside the glass and say, yeah, there's Clint over there, you know, there's Nick over there, and their babies are in a separate room. That's changing, you think?
It is, and this was on the heels of what we had heard about years ago about babies being stolen from the hospital. You remember that?
Yes, right.
And so there has been a move afoot to try to change the systems where the children now, the infants, don't leave mother's room. They stay in the room with the mom and dad throughout the hospitalization until they're discharged. Now, obviously, there's an exception for children who have neonatal problems or have to go to ICU. But most of the situations would involve a child staying in the room and having pediatric examinations or routine care in the room with mom and dad throughout, so that there is no mistake like what happened with Miss Melton's child.
Yeah, and that makes sense. I think that's the direction they're going now on this. The other case I wanted to bring up, and there may be others out there, you know, we did on the birth control device that migrated.
Marina cases, yeah.
Yeah, and we did that one. This was crazy. I mean, I interviewed this poor woman, and it was just an IUD kind of, and it actually migrated from where it was placed in her uterus. Where did it end up?
Well, one of them wound up on the woman's spine, and the other one wound up in her rectus or stomach muscles.
So it migrates somehow on its own, the muscle motion, or?
Bayer makes these, and Bayer fought and defended the cases on the basis that the plaintiffs could not prove there was anything actually defective about the device. And what Bayer was really saying is, you can't prove that these things weren't the product of bad installation, that somehow the gynecologist installed it improperly when they put it in. And that's where the battle's been pitched. And right now the judge has ordered that at this point she agrees with Bayer's analysis that the plaintiffs can't prove it's not the result of bad installation. And so my understanding is those cases are going to go up on appeal. There's going to be a whole lot of legal arguments associated with it. There's a lot of women who have cases that are hinging on how that appeal comes out.
But weren't there, okay, I know, a lot of women, and you're right, there were a lot, but there are a lot of women that used that device that did not have a problem.
Correct.
And so that judge must have looked at that. Could that many women have had doctors that didn't know what they were doing? And could you sue the doctor, too, in this case, as opposed to Bayer?
You could have sued the doctor if you could prove it was bad installation. I think what's been difficult in this, more than anything else, is testing the theory that the plaintiffs had that there was something wrong with the device. It's one thing to say it migrates out. Okay, people look at that and go, that just shouldn't happen. But it's another thing to say, well, how do you know it's not the product of bad installation by the doctor? And that gets into a whole host of issues, like what you said. Why is it that so many people, 4,000 people, could have bad installation? Isn't that a significant number? But then again, there are many, many thousands of women who had this installed, had no problem at all.
Yeah.
And so the argument would be, look, if it works for these people, why is it not working for the others? And that's where the science and the law are coming into conflict, and we're just going to have to let the Court of Appeals decide what they think is proper to do in those cases.
By the way, and a lot of these become large class action cases. Right. What about when the FDA makes a mistake? And yeah, they make mistakes, and perhaps approve something that turns out to be deadly, and it wasn't, the testing, and the FDA does, I guess, the job of trying to review what was done before something new is approved. And by the way, it takes forever for the FDA to approve stuff.
Classic example is Vioxx.
Okay, yes.
That's a classic example.
I remember, to remind folks, Vioxx, I remember this.
It was a non-steroidal, anti-inflammatory. It was the thing. It was meant to be, I guess you would call it ibuprofen plus, and it was prescribed by doctors for many years, and then men in particular, but also some women, started having heart attacks after taking it. And what they found out was Vioxx has, as part of its ingredient, the capability to increase cardiovascular risk in men. And enough of these started happening where the FDA detected what they call a signal, and that just means a lot of people are getting sick. And they issued a black box warning and shut it down, said you can't sell it anymore. And that would be a situation where arguably the FDA looked at the clinical trials and did not investigate closely enough to determine whether or not the makers of Vioxx, which was Merck, had properly conducted clinical trials.
What was your take? They did clinical trials, right? I mean, did it just not show up in those trials for some reason? They didn't do it long enough? What do you and then you can always say, did they know about it and push it through anyway?
It's actually what you just said. It was those two things. It was, first of all, the clinical trials were deemed inadequate in time.
Not long enough.
Patient sample, and there was actually a heart attack risk that was detected in the clinical trials. The problem is Merck minimized that as being sort of an outlier, and the argument was if you conducted the clinical trials properly, you would have realized that there were actually more cardiovascular risks associated with that drug. That's the problem, is the FDA has to rely on the manufacturer's ability to conduct proper clinical trials. If those clinical trials are defective and the manufacturer hides those defects, the FDA rarely can pick up on that. And we need to let the public know, the FDA is not a bunch of people walking around with white coats on with beakers,
no,
doing
they don't
this.
have the resources to test everything.
They're people dressed like you and me,
the bureaucrats.
Or bureaucrats who go into the office, they drink a cup of coffee, they start reading through paperwork that they'll get about a drug, and they go through, and there's a process you go through. And once you get to the end of the process, they just sign off, and there goes the drug, or there goes the medical device. It's not a bunch of super science people basically doing all the research and checking on the drug that the manufacturer does. They rely on the manufacturer's good faith and clinical trials to make judgments on their own.
So the only incentive the manufacturer has not to cook it, to just get something out there and make some quick money, is that if they do screw it up and people die, then people like you are going to step in and sue their butts. I mean, because other than that, I mean, I'm sorry, I'm not going to sit here and trust big business. I just don't in general, unless they know someone's watching them. But if the FDA is not testing, obviously, and they can't test it all, they have to take it and believe what they're getting. And so, what's to stop a major pharmaceutical company? The only thing you can imagine is the lawsuits that can come. But what if they rationalize it and just say to themselves, let them sue, but in the time we're selling this, we're going to make billions. Well, we can just pay that out. So we lose a few lives, but we make money.
Some of the states, unfortunately, passed laws restricting those lawsuits, saying that if the FDA approves the drug, that is evidence, in some cases, the evidence that the drug is not defective.
That's absurd after what you just told me
exactly.
anyway.
Well, the point of that was to drive down product liability cases against makers of drugs and medical devices.
Well, yeah, because they're so broke.
Right.
Man, it's just yet another reason, Clint, why, and I know many of you have no choice, and I'm not saying you should change it. I never want to have to take, and I've taken pills. I don't want to take any kind of pill for anything, including aspirin. You know, I just don't trust any of these new pills that come out, statin drugs, things like this. And I know, again, some of them do help and save lives, obviously. But, you know, you get prescribed drugs these days that oftentimes you have to take the rest of your life for certain things like cholesterol. I mean, yeah, that may save you from getting hardening of the arteries, but I don't trust it, don't want it, don't like it.
And that's the problem, is when you have people who do the type of things in drug manufacturing companies that cause these types of problems. The unfortunate consequences, it results in lack of trust in people like you, where there are a lot of drugs that are very good, they're very safe, they've been studied over and over.
Like I said,
statins are one of them.
Yeah, right.
But it leads to people like you saying, I don't think I can trust taking that drug.
Or I even worry you're taking that one, which may be just fine, but then, you know, I'm going to be prescribed another one. And then what happens when those two combine and commingle in your system?
Now I'll bring up something else that we've never talked about.
Yeah.
We're talking about whether or not
Is this going to scare me? Is this going to scare me?
A little bit.
I mean, sometimes you scare me, but go ahead.
Generic drugs and drug makers have been known from time to time to use different ingredients to make the same type of pill. And so some pills are not as effective as others, depending on the manufacturer. So you may get a pill that's the ingredients or the mixture to make the pill is different than what you would get at other places. And let's call it watered down or diluted pills that don't work as well as they're supposed to. And the user doesn't know it unless someone gets sick because they haven't gotten the proper amount of medication. That happens more than you know.
Oh, yeah,
and I think that's going to be, in the years to come, that's going to be a greater and greater problem as we import more and more drugs overseas.
No kidding. By the way, all right, so for instance, and there are a lot of generics that are great and work, but I've had friends tell me that they've come off the name brand or whatever and bought the generic and did not have the same result.
Right.
For whatever reason.
Right.
And it's probably for the is that the cause, potentially? That it's just
It is. A best way to explain to people is, you remember that compounding pharmacy that caused all those fungal meningitis cases. Well, all they're doing is they're mixing drugs. On a grand scale, large scale, people who make manufacturing generic drugs, they use the same process. They are mixing ingredients to create a particular pill. Well, if those ingredients are neutered or watered down and you don't get the full amount of the drug, in some cases it can kill somebody because they're not getting enough of it. But you won't know 5-10 years later in some cases.
Dang. All right, pills, that's another aspect of it. Besides whatever treatment you're getting, the medicines as well. We'll take a break, be back with our final segment. We've got some lines open, 737 if you'd like, or just sit back and listen in. He tells a good story. We'll be back more with Clint Kelly right after this.